If you know nothing about bacterial flora, it doesn't matter, because this information is still useful for understanding the logic behind trying to repair a bacterial flora that has lost diversity, in which we have an overgrowth of bacteria or parasites or fungi that we do not want. And we have to try to recover all these processes that we somehow broke, and that modified homeostasis altered our balance, which is that our bacterial flora needs a balance. To maintain that balance, we need to keep certain habits, a certain type of diet, a certain type of movement, and a certain type of circadian cycle. We cannot, for example, stay up all night and then expect to have no biological consequences in our body. So, it requires us to do certain things. And why is this important? Because we can try to recover, for example, some beneficial bacteria for our body by taking supplements like probiotics, which are very well known today. What is the problem with this? If I do not repair the underlying mechanism by which I am losing bacterial diversity, it is an infinite game. It is a game where I will always need probiotics to try to compensate for this damage that I am doing to my digestive system and to my bacterial flora. What is the mistake here? The first mistake is that the supplements we have today do not contain the necessary amount of bacteria to compensate for the damage we have been doing. Why? Because all these communities that have a much more traditional lifestyle with a greater diversity of bacteria have tens to hundreds of times more bacteria than you. We are talking about people who have hundreds of different bacteria to thousands of different bacteria. And why is this extremely important? Because I cannot recover those thousands of bacteria with a supplement that has 10, 15, or 20 different types of bacteria, because we do not have the necessary substances to take it as a supplement. So unfortunately, we need to change these habits. In order to change these habits, what we need to understand is that a one-size-fits-all approach does not work for everyone. Someone who has a problem digesting vegetables, for example, does not need the same advice and the same probiotic supplements as someone who has a problem digesting proteins. They are completely different because the balances of different families of bacterial flora that we have in our bodies are altered and are not the same among themselves. We have bacteria on one hand that feed on soluble fiber and help us, for example, to stay active, to keep our energy levels stable throughout the day, and to burn fat. And we know that these bacteria feed on soluble fiber and that they produce one of the famous substances they produce is butyrate, which is a substance from which we can extract energy as a reserve and is very similar to the ketone bodies in our body. So it is interesting to understand that each family of bacteria requires me to do something different to replenish it. On one hand, for example, when we have protein digestion disorders, we start to have bacteria. We start to increase bacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide, that produce inflammatory substances such as lipopolysaccharides, which produce substances derived from ammonia. So this entire balance of bacterial flora somehow has to be compensated. But according to the problem that I have, why? Because these bacteria that are, for example, producers of all these substances like hydrogen sulfide will be harmful if I do not repair my protein digestion. And the solution is not to take a supplement. The key is to understand that each of these functional groups of bacteria, those that produce vitamins, those that produce hydrogen sulfide, those that produce substances derived from ammonia, those that produce butyrate, etc., they need a different measure for me to repair them. Because some need soluble fiber, and others, like these derivatives that feed on undigested proteins, need me to repair my protein digestion. What they need is for food that should not have arrived in the first place, not to reach them because I have a digestive problem.
In the end, of course, many times the recommendation or what we think of first is prebiotics and probiotics, but it is clearly insufficient compared to the approach you mentioned regarding bacterial families. So, how could we imagine? And there are different degrees, as always, of approach. There are different complexities, different patients. But if the starting point is the loss of bacterial diversity, would there be a more or less common initial approach that could be conveyed to the patient to start taking care of their entire microbiota and digestive system?
Without a doubt, let's divide it into levels to make it practical. For those watching this for the first time, in some way, at level 1, without a doubt, it has to do with diet. It does not involve using any type of supplement, any type of substance, or any type of analysis. Level 1 of complexity has to do with, on one hand, increasing the variety of foods that we should consume, including organic vegetables and fruits, pasture-raised animals, and trying to eat offal as well. That type of diversity helps me maintain greater bacterial diversity, obviously avoiding industrialized foods, avoiding refined sugar foods, and foods that are pro-inflammatory. But if I stick to these more classic types of pyramids, within what we know that everyone should consume some seeds and nuts, including animals, eggs, fish, seafood, and offal. Why do I insist so much on offal? Because they naturally have a balance of amino acids that is less repetitive. This is very interesting. Why? Because if I constantly eat the muscle of the animal, the pattern of amino acids that I will receive is constant because I am always degrading the same types of proteins. In contrast, when I consume offal, for example, I have different tissues and the diversity of amino acids that I consume is different and obviously greater. And this is important because many times increasing a specific type of amino acid but not the others hinders the proper absorption and digestion of these amino acids. This is the first interesting point regarding what is an easy level to change and trying not to need any substances that we know harm the bacterial flora, such as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and obviously antibiotics. Level 2 has to do with starting to understand that we will not be able to compensate with food, at least for most of us, the disorders of bacterial flora that we have and the loss of bacterial diversity that we have, for the simple reason that the foods we eat come from soils that have already lost bacterial flora. Naturally, when I use pesticides and decrease the amount or diversity of bacteria in the soil, unfortunately what I do is reduce the availability of many nutrients for the plant as well. So it is very interesting. Why? Because this decrease in the variety of bacteria that we have in the soil leads to a decrease in nutrients in the food that I will later consume and an increased chance of developing nutritional deficiencies afterwards. That is why there is so much talk today about regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, and permaculture, which aim to repair these phenomena by increasing that bacterial diversity. And that is a very interesting process because it does not require me to do anything special. I have to consume the same foods that I was going to consume otherwise, only that what changes here are the sources, how the food was prepared, in what soil it was planted, etc. And it is something very simple to carry out. What I can do together at this level 2, besides that diet, is to start consuming fermented foods, which I know incorporate bacteria, mainly incorporating a few types of bacteria, mostly lactobacilli, which are the ones that grow when we ferment, for example, dairy. So, consuming kefir, consuming Greek yogurt, consuming various types of fermented drinks and foods, kimchi, natto, is one that I particularly like. They provide me with a greater bacterial diversity and a greater amount of bacteria, because fermented foods are rich in those bacteria precisely. It is of no use to me to seek out a fermented food that is then pasteurized because I lost those bacteria. That is level 2. A level 3 already incorporates. It does all of this, but includes some type of supplements, incorporating these soluble fibers in the form of supplements, as I mentioned before, that help ensure that the food the bacteria need arrives in sufficient quantities to the bacteria. On one hand, the most classic is inulin, but we have psyllium husk, we have fructooligosaccharides and xyloligosaccharides, which are all different types of soluble fiber, and surprisingly, and this is a very high level of complexity, surprisingly each type of soluble fiber serves different types of bacteria. Inulin is not useful for all the bacteria in our digestive system, so that is the first step we can take. And the second step, obviously, is to incorporate the intake of probiotic supplements that already bring a large amount of bacterial diversity, about 20 bacterial strains, for example, which help me maintain this diversity. If I don't do everything right, if I do things wrong, and I know that I make mistakes regarding my diet, I make mistakes regarding medications that I absolutely need to use because I have health issues, etc. It is very interesting to at least compensate for the damage with these two types of supplements, with probiotic supplements where I know I maintain that bacterial diversity, and prebiotic supplements where I know I help beneficial bacteria not die and develop further. A higher level of complexity for me has to do with studying the bacterial flora. Alfredo, there is a reality that each one of us is different, and the most reasonable method to understand what I need is to study my bacterial flora, to take a sample of my feces, genetically sequence my bacteria, and understand based on this which bacterial groups I have developed more and which bacterial groups I have developed less. Why is this important? Because this will help me deal with all the symptoms related to, for example, intolerances to certain foods that could be related to your bacterial flora, and that your bacterial flora is not prepared to digest that amount of foods from that specific group. And that is why you are experiencing these symptoms. So repairing and maintaining that flora in balance is very good, and obviously requires a preparation of supplements like probiotics, personalized according to Sebastian's fecal matter, what bacteria he needs, and the specific supplement is prepared to compensate for that damage. That is the highest level, if you will, within what has to do with supplementation specifically designed for one, aiming to repair only bacterial flora. We haven't even delved into what has to do with the digestive system, the functioning of the digestive system. But this vicious circle you mentioned at the beginning exists if I have damage to my bacterial flora and cannot properly digest food. Obviously, I will present digestive symptoms, and obviously these digestive symptoms over time will create that vicious circle where they further damage my bacterial flora.
Magnificent, magnificent proposal in 4 points. I remember, on one hand, start with this diet that has greater variability, trying to ensure it is of organic farming quality. On the other hand, not only the diet, but also introducing fermented foods that can directly provide more of these bacteria that we need. At a third level, turn to supplements, starting with fiber, what our bacteria need, soluble fibers, and then also turn to probiotics. And finally, that personalized study at the genetic level of our bacteria that would allow for the personalization, for example, of supplementation. Some questions regarding this, doctor? The issue of increasing the variability of our diet. We have talked about fruits and vegetables. Fundamentally, it is discussed, for example, about the colors on the plate. What would be the goal? To introduce as many foods as possible, to introduce as many colors as possible, to focus more on vegetables than on fruits? Would it be indifferent?
Well, here the concept at the level of diet is important for 2 or 3 different reasons. In reality, the concept of colors is related to a concentration of nutrients, which is a somewhat simplistic explanation that serves the general public when they do not specifically know about nutrition. But let's get to something a little more complex. Let's give this concept a bit more of a twist. Diversity has to do with ensuring that I am not consuming too much of one nutrient or having a deficiency in another. Diversity simply in diet, as long as I stick to a sensible list of foods, we are not talking about consuming ultra-processed foods. Diversity helps to mitigate the risk of nutritional deficiencies. The first concept to understand here is essential, because all diets that are more restrictive in the range of possibilities if we want, we can think of raw veganism at one extreme and absolute carnivorism at the other. All the more restrictive diets, those that are further from the midpoint, have a higher risk of nutritional deficiencies. The less animal I consume, the greater the risk of deficiency I have of all the nutrients that come from animals. The less quantity of vegetables I consume, the greater the risk I have of deficiency of all the substances that we find in greater amounts in vegetables. Classic situation of a keto diet, of a paleo diet, causing a deficiency of magnesium and potassium. And a classic situation of a raw vegan diet is causing a deficiency of vitamin D, a deficiency of B, or a deficiency of carnitine, which we will discuss later if we have time. So the concept here is to understand the very simple situation of saying that diversity means less risk of nutritional deficiencies and more ease in sustaining bacterial diversity as well. And there are 2 or 3 caveats that I am interested in making regarding this about the food you mentioned about vegetables. The first point is that today's fruits have been modified over generations to have increasingly higher fructose content and lower fiber content. This has a negative impact on our gut flora, which, despite the modification of fruit, still needs the same type of food and the same types of substances in terms of bioavailability. What does this mean? It means that if I eat an orange today, or if I eat a banana today, the amount of sugar that reaches my digestive system is very high, and especially if I consume it, for example in juice form, directly eliminating the fiber. This has a generally negative impact on my gut flora, negative for hormones like insulin, because the blood sugar spike is very high. Obviously, it is less severe than any industrialized food that already contains refined sugars, but it is a negative impact nonetheless on the gut flora. And the third concept is that these rules we mentioned apply to everyone, except in situations where we have SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where if I start consuming fermented foods, I will suddenly become even more bloated and will present more symptoms, and the solution goes in another direction. And then in scenarios where we have, for example, the consumption of foods which we can test with those genetic analyses I mentioned earlier about gut flora, what is done is that it no longer grows on a petri dish like we did in microbiology with a bacterium, but rather the genetic sequence is analyzed to identify it, and based on that sequence, it is known whether it is lactobacillus, the lactobacillus, etc. So that sequencing also allows me to identify if I have viruses in the foods that I consume, and this is important because I can consume cucumber or tomato, thinking that it is fabulous, thinking that it has a great impact, without having any digestive problems, but incorporating a virus, for example, called the mosaic virus, which can cause an alteration in the bacteria that we have in our digestive system. So the levels of complexity are infinite. Don't worry if you don't understand this. The concept is that the diversity of foods is beneficial, and there are small situations where it can negatively impact me. Does this mean I have to stop eating cucumber, stop eating tomato? No, because the virus from one plant can be in any plant really, just as humans have viruses, plants have viruses, and obviously that impacts the bacteria that can develop or not. Then the concept is dietary diversity, trying to maintain a low glycemic index, which means not drinking fruit juice or ideally eating the fruit with its own fiber, or trying to eat fruits that have a lower glycemic index, like red fruits, for example, berries, and not so much the fruits with a higher glycemic index. Those are the attempts we can make at the dietary level, clarifying these points. And then regarding nutrients and colors, I would say it's more about understanding what nutritional deficiencies I am at risk of and thinking about it from that perspective.